Here I'll demonstrate my techniques for preparing photos for wood engravings, and I'll be using a 50-watt Chinese laser cutter and only free software packages. Now I'm going to very much focus on image processing methods and wood preparation, so the video will be a bit lengthy because I want to cover all the details. I'll be using free software to set up all the engraving. So I'm going to use GIMP as an alternative to Photoshop for doing all the manipulation of the photo to get it ready. Inkscape is optional. This is what I'm going to use to do things like add text and to compose it to match the wood that I'm going to put it onto. And RDWorks is a final laser cutting software which came with your machine. So first the photo. Now if you don't have a scanner, you can just hold it up and take a photo with your camera. The resolution, the quality doesn't have to be very good here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just cut out and crop that. Now what I want to do is I want to isolate the main subject from the background. So I'm going to use a free select tool to trace it out. Now it doesn't have to be terribly accurate because engraving's going to have kind of fuzzy edges, so don't bother trying to use things like the magic scissor function to get your lines straight. So I'm just going to go around this and then come back. Alright, so this has taken me about 2 minutes or so to trace out. Now any other gaps you can hold down shift and you can trace those out too to just add it. So now I'll look at the entire image. So what I've done is I've selected all the backgrounds because I want to take care of that first. So the first thing I'm going to use is a desaturate to convert it to black and white. Doesn't really matter which one you choose because we're going to do a bit more editing on that. So then what I would normally do is I would just reduce the contrast because I kind of want the backgrounds to be sort of faded away from the main subject. This is not so bad, this picture, because the foreground and the background is separated by this water, but if it was like a more busy picture, like people standing in like a room, I would probably give it a bit more contrast than I'm giving here. Maybe a little bit of brightness. Okay, then the next thing I want to do is I want to make this much lighter than everything else. So using the levels function, I'll just drag it down so the whites are fairly white. And I don't want it to ever get too dark, so I'm just going to reduce the range of colours that are making up the background so it's not going to overpower the image. Okay, so I'm happy with what I've done with the background, so I'm going to invert my selection. So now I've got the foreground selected. First thing I'll do is convert it to grey with the desaturate tool. Now I'll just pick the one that has the most contrast first. Now the tricky part here is to really get our contrast between the blacks and the whites correct so it will engrave properly. So here's a test pattern here. So this is relative, intensity of blackness, and when I engrave it at a at a very low power, which is probably the best power to use to get an engraving without getting too much overburn, you find that anything that's about 60-70% blackness comes out perfectly black. And it's fairly light here, but it quickly starts to get dark, so our dynamic range of our intensity is fairly narrow, and this is something that takes a lot of sort of experience to get around. You're going to have to do it a fair few times to get it right, So we're going to use this curves feature. So this is similar to the levels, but it's going to sort of give us a little bit more control. So what I want to do is make the whites fairly white. Okay, so a few things I'll make very black that I would definitely want to be black for outlines. And then I'm going to trim it down so the range of our intensity is going to be like a very sort of narrow band. So it does look kind of very poor if you were going to print it as an image, but when it engraves it's going to come out really good. Now while I've got this isolated, there's a few more things I want to do. So I'll zoom in here. Because we got white and white there, I'm going to take a brush, not going to press too hard. I'm using 50% opaqueness, so I can just sort of like gently put some contours. So this will give a little bit of contrast when it engraves out. That's fine because it's only a small little sliver there, maybe a bit there. Then I want to come back and I might just do a bit of a curve around there. Alright, now the thing I want to do is I'm going to have to really sort of draw this fishing rod. So first I'll just sort of darken up the runners a bit. Okay, and then using the same brush, I'm just gonna let's get that out there. Start sort of drawing a dark line on the top. Then with a slightly bigger and a little less intense, kind of sort of draw the pole up a bit. Alright, now I'm done with everything else in this selected part, so I'll just select this little bit of rod here and I will kind of do the same thing. I'll have a written guide with all of this stuff if I'm going through this a bit too fast. Okay, so now I will step back and view the whole image again. Select all. Now I don't want hard edges when I'm engraving, so I'm going to use the eraser tool. First I'll start with a smoke pattern. I'll make the brush fairly large. Use it at about, yeah, I'll leave it at about 60%, and I'll just sort of, I'm not holding, I'm just clicking here, just getting a little bit of a blend started. And then I'll go to something more stronger like this Gaussian blur. Make it about half the size and do it a little bit harder, and then just holding the mouse button down, now I'll just sort of go around and take the edges off. So that's kind of how I want the picture to be done. Now there's one, I just did this one here earlier. I spent a little bit more time and did it a bit more carefully. So when I'm happy with that, I'm going to export that as a PNG format. Any image file will work. Okay, and we'll save that. One thing I'll note while we're saving it too is You're going to have to resize the image to how you want it done on the wood, but don't do it in the GIMP, because the resizing feature in the GIMP is like pretty bad and it will just like ruin the quality. Okay, so now in Inkscape, what I've done is I've drawn up a template. This is the size of my board, and this is where I want the image placed. Now you only need to do this if you're trying to lay stuff out very carefully. Otherwise you can just go straight to the RDWorks software. So I'm going to import my picture. Okay, which is huge. So I've locked the aspect ratio here, and I'm going to make it 120mm high. Now that's sort of gone off somewhere, so I'm going to tell it to come back to x equals 0, y equals 0. Here it is. Now I'm going to align this within my red square, because that's where I want it. Now I'm going to add some text. And Mum tells me this was at Lake's entrance, so I'm going to write that there. I think I want to use this font, and I'll change the size here to 32. And I think this was taken in the good old days, just before any of my brothers and sisters were born, so it was just me. So I think that puts it at 1979. Well, let's say it was. Okay, so there's how it's going to be laid out on my board as I want it. So first, my little red bounding box, I'm just going to turn that off, because what I want to do is save this as an image file. So I'm going to export it as a bitmap, the entire page, because it's what I've said is the size of my wood. Yeah, I'll call it final. Choice of timber is something that's going to require a lot of experimentation. So this first piece, this is Victorian ash, and it has like very long wood fibres in it, and also the two sort of different colours in the grain pattern, they sort of burn at different levels when you do the laser cutting. So your pattern is going to come out a bit bumpy. It's not very good for high detailed work, but for something that's simple line drawing, it's fairly serviceable. Now European beech is a little bit better. The small little dark flecks, they sort of burn slightly differently to the rest of the wood. So it can be a nice effect you want. It can leave like a nice little sort of underlying pattern, but it's still just a little bit short of doing perfect high detailed work. So what I usually use is this stuff, Fiji mahogany. I've just found that the little, like the fibers are just sort of very small. It just sort of burns away nicely, and it burns very quickly to a very dark black color. So you can run the laser along fast, get your dot drawn without any sort of overburning and stuff. So for all my really fine detail work, Fiji mahogany is what I usually choose. Cherry's also a bit good too, and for a darker wood, walnut comes out quite nicely. Now the next thing to consider is about your preparation. You want to know what you're going to do to finish it. So anything that like soaks into the wood, like something like an oil or a stain, you know, anything like that which is going to penetrate the wood and be absorbed, you want to apply that before you do your laser cutting. And the reason is because once you apply it, it swells up the wood a little bit. So if you've just done your beautiful pattern, you've cut it out, then you apply the stain, it's going to sort of swell and reduce the fine detail. But if you pre-swell the wood with the stuff, it's perfectly fine. Now for things such as like polyurethanes, any kind of lacquers that go onto the surface of the wood, do that after you've done your laser cutting, because all it's going to do if you do it before is add just another layer you have to burn through. Now what I use normally is this mixture I make myself of beeswax and mineral oil, which is kind of half and half. It's got oil and it's got like the surface wax on it. So what I do is I take a little bit and I dilute it sort of very heavily with mineral oil, apply that first. So this is the board I'm going to use for the example here, and I've already treated this with some of this wax, which has been diluted about another 10 times with mineral oil. Then after I do it, I'll take this thicker solution and then rub it over the top to protect the cut. So what I've done here is I take down a bit of cardboard and then I cut out a line where x equals 0 and y equals 0. So what that does is it gives me a line of reference so I can position stuff on the table and I know exactly where it is relative to the software coordinates, so I can lay stuff out and have it engrave exactly where I want it. So this is the board I'm going to use. Now when laying your wood down, what you want to consider is that when doing like a raster image, what happens is a laser head scans to the left and right and steps down and does it in that pattern. So you want to take the grain of your wood and you want to line that up in the left and right direction too. So for like things with lots of just fine detail, you probably won't notice a difference. But if your image has a really large area of like dark black space, what you'll see is if you align it this way, it's cutting across the grain and you're going to end up with kind of like a cross-hatching pattern in your black area. But if you go with the grain, it generally minimizes that and all you'll see is like black and the lines of the grain pattern. So I'm going to line that down, and then I'm going to use this 10mm spacer just to keep it off that edge. I'll explain in the software why we need to do that. Then I'll just set the focal depth and I'll go back to the computer and set the cutting up. So I've opened up the RDWorks software. What I'm going to do is import, and then what I'm going to do is rotate it 90 degrees, just like I had it in the laser table. So my position reference is the upper left hand corner, and I'm going to set it to x equals 10, y equals 0. Now the reason I've set that to 10 is for some reason the software or the laser, one of the two, doesn't like it when you have a bitmap image right close to the end. I think it likes to sort of oversweep when it's running it back and forth. I don't know, who knows. Okay, so now the bitmap image is there. Now we want to tell it how we're going to handle the greys. So we go to the bitmap handle function. Now the output resolution 300 dpi is what we want to do, and we want to use a dithering pattern. Now these three at the bottom, they don't seem to actually really do anything useful. Dot graphics is what we want. Net graphics, what that does is it shades in a hatching pattern. Now that doesn't really start to look good until you're doing like a really big picture, so which would be something like close to half the size of like your laser bed, like about 30 by 30 centimeters. So with dot graphics selected and our DPI set, we'll click apply to view. Then when we click on it, okay, that just confirms that it's ready. Now for the bitmap, we're going to do it at maximum speed, and depending on how sort of dark you want it to come out, experiment a bit. Anywhere I find from about 20 to 30% power. Works out pretty good, which for this 50 watt laser machine works out roughly to somewhere between about 8 to 15 milliwatts is what you want your total power to be. So I'm going to make this 20, and I don't know, let's just turn these black lines off so it doesn't do any cutting. So it's only going to do the bitmap image. It's in absolute coordinates, so that means it will do it relative to how we've got the page set up. And then I'll just go back over to the table and set things up when we're ready to go. Okay, so here we are, everything's lined up, ready to start the cutting. So here's how it comes out, then compared to the original photo. Now, just to give you an idea of what I was describing before, I did a test copy on some European beach, so you can see how the image is still pretty good, but you can see these kind of ridges in the pattern from the grain in the material and how it sort of has different burn rates. But this also can produce a nice effect. You might want something that looks a bit more woody, and in that case choose something with a grain pattern. Otherwise, something like Fiji mahogany here gives a nice, smooth, beautiful finish. So now, just to show you the final piece, I added a bunch of fixings and some extra strong magnets to make a bottle holder to catch your caps and hang on the fridge.